thank you so much for these lovely introductions, and to all of you for coming out this evening to be here in person. I want to say a special thanks to Laura. She's put so much time and effort into preparing for tonight, which makes my job very easy. I'm just going to do a short reading from the book, from a section where I really begin to look at the books as artifacts. So my mum was one of the first literary scholars to write on Coetzee's work in the early 80s. And so she had all his first edition books and still has them. And I thought this would be a nice section to read, given that after this part of the evening, anybody who's interested can come and have a look at some of the Coetzee rare books donated by Graham and Anita Anderson, who are here tonight. I met Graham many years ago when he came to one of my readings, and then wrote a profile of him in the Saturday paper because I was fascinated by his work as a collector of first editions of fiction, and he has amazing stories to tell. So please do follow us upstairs afterwards and get him to tell you a little bit more about what the book collecting means to him. I'm holding in my hands my mother's copy of Dusklands, Coetzee's very first novel. It's the original Raven Press edition from 1974. The paper jacket is torn at the spine, attached to the book by its folds alone. The cover image is a watercolour of a South African landscape, rocky outcrops, arid land, a few naked black figures, and what look to be two clothed white ones. This is the frontier landscape which Jacobus Coetzee, JM's ancestor, and the narrator of the second half of the book, travels through in 1760, wreaking vengeance on his captors for daring to see him as a man, fallible and absurd, rather than as a white god, as the blurb copy puts it. Coetzee's star burns so brightly in the firmament now that it's hard to imagine him in the role of debut author. It's as if he leapt, fully formed, from wherever it is that prodigies are made, and took his rightful place among the literary greats. So I'm taken aback by the hedging tone of the description on the book's first edition dust jacket. It is probably the first truly major modern South African novel, and must be judged by the standards of the best modern fiction with no qualifications. And the author bio on the now age-spotted back flap, no accompanying photo, is rather bizarre. J.M. Coetzee was born in Cape Town in 1940. After 10 years in Britain and the USA as student, lecturer, and employee of multinational corporations, he returned to South Africa in 1971. He is presently a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. Dusklands is his first work of fiction. Among his interests are crowd sports, other people's ailments, apes and humanoid machines, images, particularly photographs and their power over the human heart, and the politics of assent. For the rest, he is one of the 10,000 Coetzees, and what is there to be said about them except that Jacobus Coetzee begat them all? It is a mind warp to think of Coetzee as a mere employee of multinational corporations and a lowly lecturer. Coetzee is a common Afrikaans surname in South Africa, which goes some way to explaining his final comment. But what author has the guts to put something that cryptic and confrontational on his first book? Why had I not thought of saying in my earliest author bio that among my interests are apes and humanoid machines? In fact, as I learned from J.C. Kannemeyer's 2012 biography, Coetzee had not agreed to this bio. He later complained that it had been lifted without permission from a letter he'd sent to Raven's publisher. What a pity it wasn't his idea after all. Yet it is intriguing to see an author who would later exert such strict control over the presentation of his books as a powerless first-timer. He disliked the insipid cover image too. He had suggested a black and white photographic plate from 1904 showing Khoisan people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Cape, from the front and side, reduced to objects of scientific scrutiny. On that matter, he'd similarly been overruled. My mother's copies of Coetzee's first books have the aura of relics for me because they reverberate with her passionate readings of them. As artifacts created just as he started out on his life as a published author, they also say something unexpected about who he was then and can be experienced outside of all the padding and praise in which the later ones come swaddled. They are still trying to make their way in an indifferent world. Coetzee worked in relative obscurity for a while. Publishers in London and New York turned down Dusklands. And even once he had become known within South Africa, he was not an international name for another decade. Part of the intensity of my mother's attachment to his work must have been linked to her sense of having stumbled on something and seen its worth before most others. She ordered this copy of Dusklands in 1978, while heavily pregnant with my older sister, after seeing a flyer offering 3 new South African books for R9, then the equivalent of $9. Raven was a new publishing house, and one of the few that was prepared to make minimal profits and face the risk of being shut down altogether in the prevailing climate of censorship in South Africa. She and my father were living in Pietermaritzburg, a small university town then dubbed Sleepy Hollow, where my father had recently taken a lecturing job. Soon after my sister was born, Dusklands arrived in the mailbox. My mother was stunned to discover a South African author who was writing reflexively, not just for the sake of cleverness or theoretical sophistication, as she felt many of the postmodern American authors were, but to draw attention to what it meant to write fiction from a compromised position as a white South African. It was a thrilling transgression, a political act in itself, for her to read a book so critical of the enterprise of empire, whether in the form of America trying to destroy Vietnam or colonizers savaging the New World. While she read, she felt as though Coetzee were writing just for her, in uncanny recognition of their shared history, both immediate and ancestral. From the scraps she gathered, she guessed that, like her, Coetzee was an English-speaking child of an Afrikaans father, whose forebears had been in the country almost from the beginning of European settlement. He too had been a student in Cape Town, then lived a peripatetic life, working and studying in Europe and the United States before returning to South Africa. She read Dusklands again and again. Though she didn't yet know it, Coetzee was no stranger to that same feeling of being struck by lightning. In youth, there is a description of John buying a copy of Samuel Beckett's novel What from a second-hand bookstore. From the first page, he knows he has hit on something. Propped up in bed, with light pouring through the window, he reads and reads. John obsessively returns to Beckett's middle period novels, letting this close reading influence the cadences of his own writing and even his habits of thinking. After discovering that the University of Texas at Austin held Beckett's manuscripts in the same archives that now hold his, Coetzee wrote his PhD thesis on Beckett and was able to pore over drafts of What, set down in exercise books filled with sketches and margin notes. When I recently reread Dusklands, I was assailed by the brutality of the imagery, the terrible scenes of rape and murder, of disembowelment. I found it hard to read the section in which Eugene Dorn stabs his young son with a fruit knife, or the passage where a child is shot between the shoulder blades and hurled to the ground with the force of a horse's kick. I asked my mother how she could possibly have read this with my newborn sister at her breast. She responded that she was so stimulated by the intellectual challenge of his writing, so preoccupied by the mental activity of interpretation, that she scarcely registered the violence. There's evidence of this in the marginalia of her copy of the book. In her handwriting, more familiar to me than my own, are snippets that let me peek inside that most elusive of places, parental consciousness. They are palimpsests of her readings over time as she returned to the book over a period of years. She notes themes as they emerge, conventions of writing, evacuation, ingestion, totem and taboo, and images that recur in both the American and South African sections, livers, massacres, masters, penetration. She underscores a phrase from the novel, "I grew out of books." These glimpses, while tantalizing, are fragmentary. Why, for example, did she underline, "He is now a failed creative person who lives vicariously off true creative people" on the first page of the novel? Why has she circled the word fish in the phrase, "grey plains, the shadowless green light under which, like a pale, stunned deep-sea fish, I float"? Once she'd finished reading Dusklands, my mother went straight to the library to take out In the Heart of the Country, which had been published in 1977. Then she waited impatiently for another book by him, until finally, in 1980, the year I was born, Waiting for the Barbarians appeared. When I look at the cover of her copy of Barbarians now, I feel a wave of nausea, something to do with the vertigo of inhabiting my childhood consciousness again. I have a memory from about the age of 10 of furtively paging through this book. The language frightened me. One eye is rolled back, the other eye socket is a bloody hole. The sex scenes bewildered me. I was horrified to find in the final pages a scene where the magistrate has sex with a woman, prostitute was not yet in my vocabulary, while her baby sleeps in the corner of the room. On the front cover of this early copy of Waiting for the Barbarians, there is a glowing endorsement from Nadine Gordimer, who was then more esteemed than Coetzee. As colleagues, they would have a complicated relationship for decades afterwards, especially after Gordimer, the champion of social realism and committed literature, panned a later novel of his for lacking in political courage. It's somehow heartening that even Coetzee's publishers once needed to ask his more illustrious peers for jacket blurbs with which to woo readers. Coetzee's bio had, by that stage, been whittled down into a dry, impersonal form, but he must have given in to the demand to include an author photograph, for there is a small black and white portrait of him on the back cover of the book. He has dark hair, a high forehead and jutting cheekbones, and a black beard, but half his face is in shadow, and he's looking past the lens. "No photograph will ever tell the truth," he wrote in a later essay on Beckett, describing photographs in which Beckett was as lean as Kafka and with the same piercing gaze, a man whose inner being shines like a cold star through the fleshly envelope. He could have been describing himself.
Thank you so much for that stunning reading from this equally stunning book, Ceridwen. It's such a delight to be here tonight speaking to you about this book. I would also like to thank and acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and their elders, past, present and emerging. So we come here to this incredible place on this amazing country, and we're surrounded by books, even though the walls don't show it. Deep within this building, there are many books, and you yourself have surrounded yourself with the books of a very interesting author. Can you speak a little bit about how you came to this point of writing a book about him?
Well, when Chris, the publisher at Black Ink, he's here tonight, first got in touch to ask me if I would consider writing about JM Coetzee for this wonderful series, the Writers on Writers series, I said, absolutely not. It was the most terrifying proposition I had ever heard. And I think I may have said that actually out loud, or not just in my head, to Chris. And then over the weekend, I was sort of thinking about it and thinking, we have this very deep history with his work, but it's only through my mother that I have anything to say about him. because she was working on his books first as a PhD student and then publishing the first book on him in 1988, before he was really well known anywhere else. My earliest memories are of her deep engagement with his work and of seeing the books lying around. And so I thought I might ask her if I could come and have a look at her informal Coetzee archive, which is nothing like Graham's. It's actually in the back of her sewing cupboard, because it just occurred to me that I should have a look at the material. And so I was looking at the books and, these first editions, and they had that wonderful feel that, old books have, but then times that by 1,000, because suddenly I saw that, all her notes and her marginalia were still in there. And I kept digging, and there were some more notes from, the PhD, and then her book, which is like this big and, in her own words, unreadable, because it's very dense with theory that I cannot understand, and still to this day cannot understand, though I admire it greatly. And then right at the bottom of the box was this series of letters between her and Coetzee, and they were written on aerograms in the early 80s. One of them that he'd sent from America was during the Olympic year when America was hosting, so it had all these athletes on it with leg warmers and headbands and, very 80s style. And when I'd forgotten that they had this brief correspondence, and then reading the letters, I realised actually maybe I do have something to say about his work if my mum will give me permission to really walk through her mind and her engagement with his work. And it felt sort of right, because I'm now the age that she was when she first embarked on that journey. So it felt like a real gift to be able to try and think my way into who she was and what it was about his work that, she absolutely fell in love with at that time.
Do you feel in love with his work in the same way? Is it a similar relationship for you?
No, my relationship with his work, the books remain opaque to me. So even though I've read them all and many times, I still can form no original opinion on them. I can only parrot things that she has said or thought about them. And I guess that goes back to some kind of like mind conditioning of, growing up with, it was her thing, it was kind of, no, I feel really, really grateful to him because of what he gave her. He gave her a life of the mind at a time when, women were still having to sort of fight for a place at that table, particularly because he was so deeply engaged with theory and was using it in his novels. And that was the real thing that she was so attracted to, was to try to decode these novels like a detective, to read the theory and read the novels and then see if she could fit them into place. And I feel that he gave us as women from the same family, because my older sister actually also has made a sort of life in a way that's linked to his work. She's a scholar of African cinema and has written on the film adaptations of his work in her scholarly work. So here's a man who is often seen as this very intimidating, sort of man's man, like really, someone that only the, people sitting in the highest of the ivory towers can unpack. And yet for us, we all have kind of, we've had food for thought from his work for most of our professional lives.
I mean, Coetzee is such an enigmatic figure. He seems almost unapproachable because of the magnitude of his work, and yet in your household he was known as JM. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mum was really strict about that. We had to call him JM, not John. He was never John. And so many, many years later, when I one day got an email from him, which maybe we'll go into later, and he signed off John Coetzee, and so I finally had proof to my mother that it was okay to refer to him as John. But I think her reason for referring to him as JM was because she understood that even by him choosing to use those initials in his in the name that he was writing under, he was signaling, as he does in all his work, to back off to people like her, to literary critics who were going to try and interpret it, that this was not him as person, but this was him in his persona as an author. And right from the beginning, he was really determined about having those two separate, and to this day refuses to interpret his own work. I know Laura went recently to the event he did at the Melbourne Writers' Festival, where he did what he always does, where when he's asked to speak, he reads a piece, reads a story. So he never gives a lecture or will do any of this kind of interpretive work. And now, of course, he's super famous, and that's, would be expected. But he did this from the beginning, when no one knew of him. I mean, publishers in, New York and London were turning down his books. And even then, he would say no to interviews that asked him to do that kind of interpretive labour.
And yet his characters can be so engaging that they almost seem real. I remember I started quoting from Elizabeth Costello in my thesis as though she was a philosopher, and I had to be reminded that she is a fictional character. And I think you describe some of the moments in his books as heartbreaking. I find it interesting that he often, or has used, the form of letters in his work, such as in his book Foe, which is told through a series of letters. And I also notice, Ceridwen, that you use letters in your work. I love the short story Red Peter's Little Lady, which is told from the perspective of Kafka's famous chimpanzee character. And then in your most recent work, in The Garden of the Fugitives, it is all told through letters. So do you see a correlation between your work and Coetzee's? Has he been an influence in that way?
I feel a bit like it's a Charlie Brown cartoon where, they're interpreting the clouds, and Linus sees the 4 horses of the apocalypse and whatever, and Charlie Brown sees the ducky and the horsey. And I feel like I'm Charlie Brown in this situation where I'm sure he's influenced my work, but I'm in the ducky and the horsey category. But yes, I think he influenced my work because I was so aware from such a young age because of Mum. So she was interpreting his work as a sort of post-colonial, postmodern work. And so right from the earliest, my earliest sense of books and fiction, I was aware that, the whole sense that there are people whose voices should be heard now, and that haven't been heard, and that, the author's dead anyway, so what's the point of, and the questioning the speaking position and where one's speaking from. And so I actually felt incredible shame when I first started to write fiction. I didn't tell my mum for a long time because I felt so ashamed as a white South African of a different generation, but who had grown up, seeing and living the realities of what happens when other voices get silenced. And then her theoretical work on top of that. She was teaching English literature in a small town in South Africa called East London, where there's a sort of outpost of a university called Rhodes University. And on the syllabus, they only had the canon, so they had the British canon. And by this point, it was the early 90s, so things had changed. And so she launched this campaign to try to get other texts, African texts, on the reading list, and mostly failed because the powers that be wouldn't. So I think I turned to fable and allegory in a way inspired by his example. And again, he's working at such a higher level, but I have found those forms floating above realism. And not having to make your context and your setting specific has let me maybe explore some of those themes of complicity and what it means to be a beneficiary of wrongdoing without having to say it out loud. Although in the most recent novel, I realised there was a block and there was sort of a silence that I was writing around, and I needed to maybe find a way to approach that directly.
because you do share a similar background with Coetzee, not just being from South Africa, but both having come to Australia and made new lives here, and the character in your new novel also experiences that. Is that so? This is a theme that you've arrived at recently. Do you find that Coetzee's work has influenced you in coming to this very difficult topic of apartheid and being a white South African in that time?
Yeah, I mean, my parents permanently immigrated here a few years before he did. So I think he came in 2002, and they ended up coming in '99. And we all now live in Sydney. But you know, I think a decision to immigrate is so personal and private and painful, no matter where you're coming from or going to. And I can't speak to what Coetzee's decision-making was, although I suspect it was in the aftermath of the publication of his novel Disgrace, which came out in '99 and won the Booker, but got him a lot of criticism in South Africa. I think it was misinterpreted. And actually, I would say that's one of the first Me Too novels. Like with anything, he is decades ahead of the rest of us. He was writing about, the debate between feminism and post-colonialism back in the 80s in Faux. And I think Disgrace, it's about a sexual assault scandal and a disgraced man who is put on the stand to account for his behavior and his process of atoning or not atoning for wrongdoing. But I think in terms of the Australian thing, it's a weird thing being a white South African who's emigrated to Australia, because you have to do a lot of work to prove that you are not a bad white South African. So there's a very weird and interesting conversation that happens even between South African emigres here, where you say, what year did you come? And then you make a judgment of them based on the year that their family emigrated. Wow. So if I say my parents came in '95, I get a certain response. But if I say we actually came the first time in 1982, I get a very different response. So in a way, I think, again, his writing was always about anticipating these kinds of, again, identity politics. His stuff right from the beginning was all about who has the right to write. And once you take up the pen, you're taking up a position of power. And if you're doing it as a white South African, and particularly living under a regime of apartheid, where even though you are not in agreement with the regime, you are still benefiting from it. You're still part of that class of perpetrators. And he was never going to write without being hyper aware of that. And that's where he uses the theory to really question. Even as he's finding a speaking voice, he's undermining it. So he's doing this really interesting thing of speaking and silencing himself at the same time. So I think all of that did lead to, me at least being aware when I started out writing of that this was a very dangerous territory, and I needed to be very careful and respectful.
The idea of speaking and silencing and power really comes up a lot in post-colonial theory, but also, of course, in feminism. And I wonder how, if that was, if your mother perhaps found a voice in her writing about Coetzee.
Mum's an interesting case because there's a lot of sadness for me in looking back at her career, and I do go into this book, because she found her voice. She had been a physiotherapist and then became sort of self-taught literary critic at the beginning. She did a distance degree in English literature and then went on to do graduate studies at the University of Melbourne. When we first moved here, she did her PhD here. But at the time, he wasn't well known, so she had to do a thesis on a bunch of Australian writers who she kind of wasn't that interested in. But She is the person who described Peter Carey's bliss as an infinite onion, which apparently became the phrase to use. But eventually she said to her supervisor, the poet Chris Wallace Crabbe, who was very supportive, said to him, look, I want to drop the Aussies. And he said, yeah, I was wondering when you'd say that. And so she, in some of the postgraduate theory classes, was exposed to, French theory was really big at the time, and theory dates so quickly, and it's so fleeting, and now it seems almost a little bit silly to think of, some of the terms that were being wielded and that people were getting so excited about. But for her, there were two turning points. She could not believe how amazingly brave Gayatri Spivak was in writing about Derrida. And Annika Lemaire wrote about Lacan's work. And so those two women at that time, early 80s, had somehow found a way to really, elbow their way in and write about these theorists and use them and speak of their, how they could be used to interpret literature differently. So that would really, I think, gave her the confidence to kind of say, okay, I'm going to do this. And you have to remember also at the time, there was nothing else published on Coetzee's work. So we can't even imagine that now. She didn't know a thing about him, She didn't, there was just nothing. And so she very slowly was having to sort of piece together, okay, here's this bits of theory and these and which passages are you referring to now? And now that's become almost not a joke, but it's a given. If you are teaching or studying Coetzee, you've got the novel here and you've got the secondary text readings that are this high next to it, because you won't understand the novel unless you read all the other books. But she was the first one to put that together and to take each bit of theory and to slot it into place in the novel. And maybe this is a good time to bring up the letters that they wrote between each other, because she eventually got up the courage and thought, okay, I'm going to write to him. He was on the east coast of America at the time. He was taking teaching gigs over there. And I don't even know how she got his address again back in the day. It wasn't like you just Googled someone, but she sent him a letter, Dear Professor Coetzee, and asked him a few questions about whether he would categorize his work as postmodern and or postcolonial. And he writes back this letter that's so great, but also quite stinging, because it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Those are not what, asking cryptic questions back about what those terms even mean. And then they have this back and forth about a series of 6 or 7 letters where she then comes in again and tries to be quite earnest and ask him, is this passage in this novel, is it Lacan you're referring to, or is it Blake, or is it Kierkegaard, who, and he pushes back again in the next letter. He does write back, which is interesting, but he writes back on the next aerogram and says, I think a good scholar should do her own detective work, which she loved. So that was like a red flag to a bull, because she's like, oh, I'm on the right track here. He wants me to do what I'm doing. He wants, I am being a detective, and he's sort of encouraging me. But when I found these letters in the shoebox, I felt like he was sort of just shutting the door on her, that she was trying to use these terms which were new and shiny for her. She'd just discovered them, and that he was, resisting, and I almost felt he was humiliating her in the letter exchange. And I said that to her, and she said, you could not be more wrong. I felt really motivated by those letters. I loved that he was pushing back against those terms, and not letting me pigeonhole him into them, and he was questioning my use of them, which made me question my use of them. And that he just refused to interpret his own work. And, she said he was a million steps ahead of me, but he was a million steps ahead of everyone, so I couldn't take it personally. So I do speak a little bit about that in the book, that, you know, here I am coming at it as the outraged daughter, you know, thinking it's something, and her experience of it was very different. And I do think he has a feminist strain in his writing that maybe hasn't always been seen or appreciated or acknowledged, but some of his female characters, I'm thinking of, you know, Elizabeth Costello, Elizabeth Curran from Age of Iron, Susan Barton in Foe, they are the most cerebral, intelligent, unashamedly, scholarly characters, female characters that you probably will ever meet on the page. And that's remarkable. And interesting that they're often criticised for being simple stand-ins for him as author, as if it's impossible that a woman could have those thoughts. And interestingly, all of those characters are also mothers. So he is really interested, I think, in that play between the tenderness and then the hardness of the theory, and he seems to capture that in those characters. And for me, that was my experience of my mother, this, you know, incredible woman who would wake up at 4 a.m. and go and do her research, and then would be my mum all day, and loved being my mum. So it wasn't like she was shutting me out of that world. She would share it with us, and then set this model of, you know, a kind of intellectual legacy, a woman who had a life of the mind that she then bequeathed to my sister and I, and gave us a model for that it was okay as a woman to want that, you know.
And has that played out in your adulthood? How has that legacy affected you?
Yeah, I didn't become an academic. I dropped out of my PhD. Everyone else in my family has a PhD, so that was a bit of a tragedy. But I love words and books, and that has to come back to her. And I describe in the book watching her. I could almost pinpoint the moment where I could see her fall through that trapdoor, you know, into her own mind. And we all know that feeling of just losing yourself, not just in reading fiction, but in the kind of, you know, interpretive work that the really great books ask of us. They ask us to meet them halfway. And one of the theorists that she used to understand Coetzee's work was Roland Barthes, and he has this wonderful term, jouissance, which is bliss, sort of joy, but more than joy, bliss. And it's a particular term that he reserves for a kind of active reading of fiction. He talks about, you know, that most of the reading we do is passive, but that when you're doing that active reading, there's something else that happens, and it's a kind of, you know, erotic experience. And I think that's why Coetzee's work is so, we can never get to the bottom of it, you know, so we keep going back. I mean, a bit like moths to the flame, but it is because he is asking so much of us as readers. It's a wonderful thing to have a lot asked of you as a reader, and I think we probably, you know, not enough books maybe do that anymore. And then, of course, not only that, but he refused to tell us what they mean. You know, we've also, I think, gotten lazy as readers. We don't even read the book. We just read the review and we say we've read the book, or we form an opinion on it. Or if we're unsure at the end of reading a novel, I'll now Google it and see, you know, oh, what does this book mean? But I think it's that real, it's a kind of pushing back against that a book can mean anything to anybody. And I think that's part of what the gift that his work can give us.
Was there a moment of jouissance when you were producing this book, in perhaps revisiting his work?
No, for me, more this book was like it's a rare experience to be able to pay tribute to a parent who's still living. And I feel really, really lucky and grateful to have had that opportunity to tell my mum, you know, what she means to me. And I think for her it was, sorry, I didn't actually finish the earlier thought about the sadness of it, that she did this work and then she published a book on him in 1988, and then she never published another one. She published a couple of articles, and she kept working in the field, but I don't really know. It was a mix of things, but I think for that generation of women, I think she lost confidence. I think she'd sort of blundered into something, and by the time she realised what she'd done, it was too late. She had kind of let it go, and hadn't backed herself. And I remember her saying to us when we were a bit younger, after you have children, make sure you have a career again, not just a job, because she always had a job, but she sort of somewhere along the way lost hold of a career, even though she'd had such a promising start. So I think for her to have me go back to that time in her life, which was really exciting for her, and a time where she was coming into her own as a woman, but a time that she was conflicted about to look back at, because it was not, I think, something she felt she had seen all the way through. It's been a very emotional but very healing experience for both of us.
Is the book, in a sense, a letter to her, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a theme of love letters and detective stories throughout. Yeah, I think so. She didn't want me to write it at the beginning because she's so sort of, modest about, it was so long ago, and, it doesn't mean anything now. So I had to work pretty hard to convince her. But yeah, and she's chosen never to meet him, so she always, again, right from the beginning, was not interested in his biography. Again, now these days it's all about seeing the author in person and getting them to sign your book, and where she was not interested in him. She took his initials, the standoffishness of the JM, she took it very seriously and focused only on the books. And so she had many opportunities over the years to meet him, and never wanted to, as a kind of respect for that boundary that he had set up for very important reasons.
So now that you've produced this beautiful book, and you've also just published your most recent work of fiction, what is next for you?
Oh,
is that a terrible question to ask?
I'm not sure. I'm interested in the the new forms of sort of mixing theory and memoir. So I just finished Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts. If you haven't read it, it's just a great. I feel like I studied as an anthropologist first, and because I thought I was going to be an academic, and then became a writer. So I sometimes feel like a split brain. But I'd like to find a way to build a hybrid practice that still draws on some of that theory, but also finds a way to make it relevant and readable. And in a way, this book really helped me understand that you don't actually have to understand the theory to say something. You can kind of use it in other ways that are still meaningful.
To say something very important. Well, I could speak to you up here all night, but I'm aware that there are other people in the room.
We didn't get to that. So, thanks for that question. So when this novel that I wrote in Cape Town called Bloodkin, which came out forever ago, the American publisher sent it, when you're a debut author, they send it off for blurbs from any author who, might put something so that someone will look at it and say, oh, so-and-so said something, and we might buy this book by this unknown author. And they sent it to Coetzee in Adelaide without knowing anything about my history, my mum's history or anything. And they didn't even tell me because it was such a long shot. She said, there's no way he would write back. But he did, and he wrote back with a blurb for this novel. And we were gobsmacked. And I then had the dilemma of what to send him as a gift to say thank you. And so I chose these cufflinks that I still kind of regret sending because they were like old typewriter keys. But you know what the dilemma was? Do I get JM or do I get JC? So I went with JC, and I feel like that was just wrong. So that was the first encounter. Then 8 years later, my next book came out, and the same thing happened. And he very kindly again, sent in a blurb. By this stage, I knew that he is incredibly generous to young authors, South African, Australian, mentors them, blurbs people's work like you won't believe, which is unheard of for someone of his stature. I mean, most authors who've won a Nobel Prize would absolutely point blank refuse to blurb someone's book, even though they depended on it in their careers. I mean, Nadine Gordimer blurbed him once. So it was very, very kind of him. Then I had the dilemma, what do I get him for the gift for this one? And I hadn't told my mother that I was going to send a gift, because she had said, when I announced that I wanted to get him something, said, you can't do that, you know, earnestness doesn't work with him, and gave me 10 reasons from French theory why that was the case. So secretly I thought, okay, everyone knows he's really into cycling. And it's the one point of connection most people have. I mean, I'm sure he's sick of having those conversations about cycling. So I thought I'll get him a book on cycling. So I bought him a book called Cycling's Golden Age, which was about the Tour de France. And then at the last minute I thought, oh, maybe I should get him some cycling gloves. But then, what size? And this was before Trump. And, you know, I was like, should I get medium or large? Like, would it be insulting if I got him size medium gloves or small? So anyway, I didn't get the gloves. And one morning I woke up after I'd sent the book, and in my inbox was an email just saying, Dear Ceridwen, I remember every word of it. Thank you for Cycling's Golden Age, John. I think that's all that was in it. And I felt like I'd received an email from God.